What if an entire family line was condemned, not by sin, but by blood? This is a fictional case study, built from invented sources, but grounded in real hereditary disease mechanisms. The Bloodmoon phenomenon is the name given within this constructed world to a documented pattern. Entire family lines, across multiple generations, suffering the same inexplicable afflictions, physical, psychological, and social, simultaneously. Every scientific mechanism described is real. Every archive and person is invented. That distinction matters and will hold it throughout. The earliest surviving record of the term within this fictional world appears in the Salmond Codex of the 9th century, an invented compendium of afflicted lineages cataloged by imagined monastic scribes who had no word for hereditary disease, so they called it a curse. The codex doesn't exist in any real archive, but the pattern it describes, hereditary disease misread as supernatural punishment, is extensively documented in real medieval medical history. In this fictional northern world, the affliction spread across 3 invented territories: the Veltmoor Highlands, the Ashford Coast, and the Iron Reach Valleys. Constructed place names, not real geography, but the dynamic they illustrate, hereditary conditions clustering in isolated communities across distinct regions, mirrors documented patterns in real populations, including the geographic concentration of porphyria variants in South African Afrikaner communities descended from a single 18th century founder. Communities didn't understand why certain families suffered while neighbors remained untouched. The moon, already a symbol of cycles and inevitability, became the obvious culprit. In this fictional timeline, a blood-red lunar eclipse in 847 CE coincided with the first recorded mass outbreak, a narrative device that maps onto a real biological mechanism we'll examine shortly. The fictional Salmond Codex describes recurring symptoms with striking consistency: trembling of the hands at the 3rd decade of life, followed by a darkening of the irises, then a gradual withdrawal from light. The same description appears in the Codex's invented records from 847, 923, and 1041. This symptom cluster, photosensitivity, neurological tremor, progressive onset in early adulthood, isn't invented arbitrarily. It mirrors the documented presentation of acute intermittent porphyria, a real hereditary metabolic disorder. Here's where the fictional mystery deepens and connects to real science. Within this constructed narrative, every major affliction surge in the Codex falls within 6 weeks of a total lunar eclipse. This is not a real historical finding, but the underlying mechanism it illustrates is real research on porphyria, including work published by the American Porphyria Foundation and clinical reviews in the Annals of Internal Medicine, confirms that light exposure is a documented physiological trigger for photosensitive porphyria variants. The fictional correlation is built on a real biological relationship. But the lunar eclipse wasn't the cause. It was a trigger, and only for those already carrying something latent in their bloodline. The fictional codex records show the affliction skipping individual members of a family, only to re-emerge in their children or grandchildren. This apparent skipping is a real feature of variable expressivity in autosomal dominant conditions. The gene is present, but environmental and epigenetic factors determine whether and when symptoms appear. Think of a dormant seed buried in frozen soil. The seed carries everything it needs to become a plant, but it won't grow until the conditions align. The afflicted bloodlines in this fictional world carried something inherited, something waiting for the right conditions to surface. In real hereditary disease, this is called incomplete penetrance. The variant is present in the genome, but external stressors determine whether the body expresses it. The fictional monastic physician in this story, Brother Aldrich of the invented Fenwatch Abbey, made the first systematic attempt to categorize the affliction in 923 CE. He's not a real historical figure, but the role he plays mirrors a real dynamic. Medieval physicians who attempted naturalistic explanations for hereditary conditions frequently faced institutional resistance. The real 12th century physician, Hildegard of Bingen, documented hereditary illness patterns in her Causae et Curae, and was similarly constrained by theological frames that demanded supernatural attribution. The social consequences in this fictional world were catastrophic. By 950 CE, in the Codex's invented timeline, families identified as afflicted bloodlines faced property seizure, forced exile, and marriage prohibition. The label of cursed was a legal instrument, not just a spiritual one. This mirrors a real historical pattern. In medieval Europe, families affected by visible hereditary conditions, including epilepsy, leprosy, and what we now recognize as porphyria, were subject to legal exclusion under ecclesiastical authority. Exile had an unintended consequence in this fictional scenario. Forced into the same remote valleys and coastal margins, afflicted families intermarried, concentrating the inherited trait across fewer and fewer lineages. The curse, as they called it, became more visible precisely because society tried to contain it. This dynamic isn't invented. It's the documented mechanism behind the South African variegate porphyria cluster, a real hereditary condition traced to a single Dutch settler couple who arrived at the Cape in 1688, whose descendants now number in the thousands. The fictional Iron Reach Valley became the epicenter. By 1041, in the Codex's invented record, 3 of every 5 families in the valley carrying the documented markers. What began as scattered affliction across 3 territories had been geographically compressed into a single community through deliberate persecution. This is the fictional version of a real genetic phenomenon, forced geographic isolation amplifying a rare variant into a community-defining trait. The persecution didn't eliminate the bloodline. The fictional codex describes the 1041 event as the Great Bloodmoon, an invented total lunar eclipse lasting 4 hours and 11 minutes, during which every documented afflicted family in Iron Reach simultaneously reported onset of symptoms. It reads less like superstition and more like a clinical outbreak report. The invented detail is deliberate. Real porphyria crisis events documented in 20th century clinical literature show exactly this pattern: simultaneous multi-patient onset within a genetically related community following a shared environmental stressor. Modern genetics offers a framework the medieval scribes lacked. Autosomal dominant inheritance means a single copy of a variant gene is sufficient to express a trait. It skips no one who carries it, but environmental triggers can determine when and how severely it manifests. This is established science, not fictional framing. The HMBS gene mutation responsible for acute intermittent porphyria follows exactly this inheritance pattern, as documented in the OMIM genetic database under entry number 17600. The closest real-world parallel is acute intermittent porphyria, a hereditary metabolic condition that causes photosensitivity, neurological symptoms, and psychological disturbance. It's triggered by stress, starvation, and light exposure. It runs in family lines, and it was historically mistaken for demonic affliction. This isn't a fictional claim. The porphyria vampire hypothesis, proposed by biochemist David Dolphin in a 1985 paper presented to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, argued that porphyria symptoms drove historical vampire and werewolf legends. Here's the counterintuitive truth this fictional case study is built to surface. The superstition and the science were describing the same phenomenon. The blood moon was not a fabrication within its world. It was a genuine hereditary affliction, misread through the only lens available: fear, pattern recognition, and the language of the sacred. The fictional codex scribes were doing what real medieval physicians did: observing accurately, interpreting within the constraints of their institutional framework. The fictional Brother Aldrich's 47 records are the pivot point of this story. He didn't use the word curse once. He documented onset age, symptom progression, and familial recurrence with the precision of a modern clinician, and was subsequently accused of heresy for suggesting the affliction was natural rather than divine punishment. This invented scenario reflects a real pattern. The actual medieval physician Pietro da Abano, who practiced in Padua in the early 14th century, was posthumously condemned by the Inquisition for naturalistic medical explanations. The fictional heresy charge against the invented Aldrich in 931 CE wasn't about faith, it was about power. If the affliction was natural, the church had no authority over it. If it was a curse, the church could offer and sell absolution. The language of superstition was an economic instrument. This fictional dynamic mirrors a real one. Historian Catherine Park, in her 1998 book, Secrets of Women, documents how medieval ecclesiastical institutions systematically suppressed naturalistic medical interpretations of hereditary and congenital conditions to preserve sacramental authority over illness. Surviving fictional payment ledgers from the invented Ashford diocese show afflicted families spending the equivalent of a full harvest season's income on ritual absolution annually. The Bloodmoon curse wasn't just a cultural belief in this world. It was a revenue stream sustained by enforced ignorance. The real parallel, historian R.N. Swanson, in his 2007 study, Indulgences in Late Medieval England, documents how English dioceses generated substantial income from indulgence payments tied to illness and hereditary misfortune, with payment records surviving in cathedral archives at Lincoln and York. But the fictional Iron Reach community kept their own records, hidden inside the walls of a collapsed longhouse. Discovered in this invented narrative in 1887 were 43 personal accounts written by afflicted individuals, describing their symptoms with clarity, grief, and a complete absence of shame. This fictional discovery echoes real archaeological finds. The Cairo Geniza, discovered in 1896 by Solomon Schechter, contained hundreds of thousands of personal documents hidden inside a synagogue wall, demonstrating that marginalized communities genuinely did preserve hidden internal records as a survival strategy. One fictional account, written by a woman identified only as Merit of the Iron Reach, describes the trembling beginning in her 28th year, exactly as the invented codex predicted. She doesn't call it a curse, she calls it her inheritance. That single word reframes everything. It's also, within this fictional world, more scientifically accurate than anything the official codex produced, because inheritance describes a mechanism, while curse describes a judgment. Merit's framing was scientifically precise without knowing it. The Iron Reach concentration created a textbook founder effect, a small isolated population where a rare genetic variant becomes dramatically overrepresented because the founding group carried it disproportionately. This isn't a fictional concept. The founder effect is documented in real populations. The Amish community of Lancaster County carries a dramatically elevated rate of Ellis Van Creveld syndrome, traced by geneticist Victor McCusick in 1964 to a single founding couple who arrived in Pennsylvania in the 1740s. The lunar eclipse connection is the final piece of the fictional mechanism and the most scientifically grounded. A total lunar eclipse shifts ambient light into deep red wavelengths, the precise spectrum that triggers photosensitive metabolic responses. For a population carrying porphyria-like variants, a 4-hour blood red eclipse would constitute a genuine physiological stressor. This is established photobiology. Research published in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology confirms that red spectrum light at sufficient duration triggers porphyrin accumulation in photosensitive individuals. 3 factors converged in fictional Iron Reach by 1041. A genetically concentrated population, a community already weakened by exile and food scarcity, and a 4-hour photosensitive trigger event. The Great Bloodmoon was not supernatural. It was the perfect physiological storm. Every element of that storm, genetic concentration through forced isolation, metabolic vulnerability from starvation, photosensitive crisis from light exposure, is documented in real porphyria outbreak literature. The fictional Salmond Codex ends mid-sentence in 1043. The final invented entry describes a plan to relocate the Iron Reach community to the Veldmoor Highlands, and then the ink simply stops. No conclusion, no date. The fictional scribe either died, fled, or was silenced. The record offers no answer. This narrative device mirrors a real archival phenomenon. The Voynich manuscript, a genuine 15th century document held at Yale's Beinecke Library, ends without resolution and has resisted full decipherment for over a century. In this fictional narrative, spectral imaging analysis of the codex's final pages reveals erased text beneath the visible layer, fragments suggesting a second author had begun documenting a continuation of the Ironreach lineage into the 14th century. This is an invented plot detail, not a real finding, but the technique is real. Multispectral imaging has recovered erased text from genuine medieval manuscripts, including the Archimedes palimpsest, analyzed by the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, using exactly this method. The hidden, fictional Ironreach accounts and the official invented codex tell the same story from opposite positions. One calls the affliction divine punishment, requiring institutional remedy. The other calls it inheritance, requiring community understanding. The difference between those two interpretations determined who lived freely and who did not in this fictional world, and in every real historical parallel this story was built to illuminate. The fictional Bloodmoon phenomenon wasn't unique to the invented Northern Territories. Within this constructed world, parallel records from 3 other regions describe nearly identical patterns: hereditary afflictions, lunar eclipse correlation, and institutional persecution of affected families. These fictional parallels are invented, but the real-world pattern they represent is documented. Historian L.J. Rather, in his 1965 study, Addison and the White Corpuscles, traces how hereditary conditions across medieval Europe were systematically reframed as moral or spiritual afflictions by institutional authorities in at least 7 distinct regional contexts between the 10th and 15th centuries. The most concrete real-world parallel to the Bloodmoon dynamic is the documented persecution of hereditary epilepsy in medieval France. Historian O.C. Temkin, in his 1945 study, The Falling Sickness, documents how French ecclesiastical courts between 1150 and 1350 classified familial epilepsy as demonic possession, levied fines for each episode, and prohibited marriage between affected families, generating revenue by concentrating the condition in marginalized communities through the same isolation mechanism the fictional Ironreach story illustrates. Here's the surprise the fictional case study was designed to surface. The curse framework didn't disappear with the medieval period. A 2017 study in the Journal of Genetic Counseling, led by researcher Barbara Biesecker at the National Human Genome Research Institute, found that patients receiving autosomal dominant diagnoses frequently describe their condition using language of blame, contamination, and family punishment, the same rhetorical structure as the Bloodmoon curse, even when they had full access to clinical genetic explanations. The language of curse persists inside the language of medicine. So, back to the opening question. Was the Ironreach bloodline condemned not by sin but by blood? Yes, but the condemnation wasn't in the gene. It was in the interpretation. When you encounter a hereditary condition described in language of blame, shame, or family punishment, in a historical text, a medical record, or a conversation, ask who benefits from that framing. Merit of the Ironreach called it her inheritance. That single word is still the more accurate diagnosis.